Rachel Reeves seems to have found yet another black hole, and at this point she seems to have found more black holes than an entire season of Star Trek. But in her most recent speech, she seems to have primed us for more tax rises. But what if I told you that the biggest problem with UK taxes isn't that they're too high? Now, I know, that might sound insane, especially when it feels like half of your payslip disappears into thin air every single month. Because the truth is, most of us have been sold a completely false picture about how tax really works in this country. We feel simultaneously overtaxed, but every single public service seems to be completely broken and underfunded. And I really want to point out very explicitly, we're going to be looking at data first and foremost. This is a conversation that has political implications, but is not motivated by politics. What are high taxes? So yes, it is absolutely true to say that UK taxes have been going up for the last few years. This is just completely undeniable. And as we can see here, the UK is in yellow. And the truth is, we are approaching levels of taxation we haven't seen here in the UK for the better part of half a century. This chart measures the tax burden, defined as, quote, the proportion of income paid in taxes by an individual, organisation or country. It is measured as a percentage of GDP. But as we can see, whilst the overall rate of taxes have been going up, we do still find ourselves at the lower end of the spectrum when you compare us to the rest of the G7 here. But let's dive into this a bit more to really understand what this information is telling us. What about when we compare ourselves internationally? So take a look at this. As you can see, what you invariably find is that when you expand the analysis to look at other countries, UK tax revenue is kind of below average. We can see the UK just here in red. And so just to give you an idea, UK tax revenue is 33.5% of GDP in 2021. We should point out that we're only using this data because it's the most recent data that we have for all international comparisons. Now, as we mentioned, this is slightly below the average for the G7 at 36.3% and the OECD at 34.1%. And so what this means is whilst UK taxes are higher than most other English-speaking developed economies like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Ireland and the US, they are considerably lower than most other Western European countries, where the average tax revenue amongst the EU14 was 39.9% of GDP. But whilst you might think those are not necessarily fair comparisons, okay, fair enough, but when you look at maybe other more comparable countries, just look at where they land on this graph. Denmark, France, Norway, Germany, Portugal, all sit considerably higher than we do right now. Now, as we have already alluded to, we should point out that given that taxes have gone up, UK tax revenue is forecast to increase to 37.7% of GDP by 2027 to 2028, which on this graph would put it about here. And as you can see, this would take the UK above both the OECD and G7 averages. But again, we should clarify and also point out that other governments may choose to increase their levels of taxation by then. So we're comparing our increased taxes in future to what their taxes are now. It's not quite a like-for-like comparison, but I think it's illustrative enough. And so the truth is, we are not even close to some of the countries that on the higher end of this scale in Western Europe or in Scandinavia. And this is the conundrum that we ultimately face. When you ask people in the UK whether they think we are a high-tax country, most will say yes, because that's how it feels, and they aren't necessarily wrong to feel that. And when you start to look at a graph like this, you can really see why. Just to explain, this graph shows how the tax burden has changed since the average of the 1990s for each of these individual countries. Again, you can see here that the UK has increased, not by as much as some of the other countries that we might compare ourselves to, but you go down the list and again, you can see Spain, Italy, Germany, Switzerland, who are all above us and some considerably above us. And just for balance, France, Norway, Australia and the US all sit below us. But if you take a country like Sweden, whilst it may still be a higher tax country than we are now, over time those tax rates have declined. So, whilst it is true to say that people in the UK are not necessarily taxed as highly as some of their other European or OECD counterparts, it is true to say that we are taxed more than we used to be. And I think this is really where we start to get to the root of the problem. Because if you're used to here, and then suddenly you end up here, no matter how you slice it, you're still going to remember the good times just here, the expectation gap. So now we've started to look at the data and we've started to delve into the problem a little bit more. Here is what I think is the heart of the problem, the gap between what we expect and what we pay for. Let me explain. There's plenty of polling data to show that if you ask most people in the UK what they want, they'll tell you a properly funded NHS, decent childcare, good schools, working trains, safe streets, all the usual things that you might expect. Essentially, for the most part, Scandinavian-style public services. But this is the rub. If you ask the same people whether they're willing to pay higher taxes to get that, most will say no. And if you take this analysis and ask the same people the follow-up question, which is who should pay for it, it will invariably be anybody but them. And this, at the end of the day, is really the crux of the problem. That for a long time, the UK has tried to provide European levels of public service, but at American levels of taxation. And we now end up in a situation where we seem to fail at both. And to some degree, this was fine when the economy was growing. That certainly was possible. And we should also point out, we are not necessarily talking about millions or even billions here. There was this report from the Institute for Public Policy Research, which calculates the cumulative amount the UK would have invested if its public investment levels had matched the OECD or G7 average over recent decades. Then that number was £500 billion. So when you hear Rachel Reeves talking about millions or single-digit billions, the truth is, she's not even in the same league. And the problem is, invariably, that leaves very little money for things like housing, infrastructure, innovation, local government. But all those things are some of the things that will actually drive long-term growth for the economy, the stuff that will critically increase productivity, which we have just done so badly at. So yes, services are absolutely nearly breaking after 2 decades of underinvestment. We're trying to run a 21st century country and a 21st century economy on a 20th century tax base. I mean, take a tax like stamp duty, a perfect example. This was introduced in 1694 and has remained, to all intents and purposes, basically the same. The broken tax mix. Now, in my view, this is a really big symptom of the problem. And I think this is really where it gets interesting. Because the issue isn't just how much we tax, but also what we tax, when we tax it, how we tax it. In the UK, we hammer people who work for a living, but we go slightly easier on those people who make money from owning things. It's why when Rishi Sunak released his tax returns, he made £2.2 million in a single year, but paid an effective tax rate of 22%. Now, income and national insurance make up the bulk of government revenue, whilst taxes on wealth, land and capital gains are much smaller than again when we compare ourselves to other rich countries. And it's really when we wake up to these comparisons, we start to see some pretty big differences crawling out of the woodwork. The classic one here really is council tax, a property tax that is based on the value of your home from 1991. If your home was built after 1991, then they just go back and guess, and invariably you end up in a very high band, shock horror. And we talked about it in this video here, where Buckingham Palace pays about £1,800 a year in council tax, but this house, which I'm currently filming in, costs me over £4,000 a year in council tax. And if we expand it more broadly, a house in Newcastle and a mansion in Knightsbridge can easily fall into similar tax bands. It's a completely absurd system, but I think really illustrates the point. But at the same time, someone earning £40,000 a year can pay a higher marginal tax rate on part of their income than someone who makes £100,000 in capital gains from selling shares, for example. More absurdities, you can buy £4,000 Balenciaga trainers for your kids and pay no VAT. But if you buy shoes for yourself from Primark, then you'll get charged 20% VAT. Any tax system that thinks spending 7 years and millions of pounds to decide whether a Jaffa cake is a cake or a biscuit needs urgently to be rethought. Or when Sir Philip Green paid himself a £1.2 billion dividend and paid no income tax and no capital gains tax. Now, I sound like I'm preaching about a wealth tax here, and I'm not necessarily, because my view is even if you wanted to look at a wealth tax, there's little point even looking at it until you fix the other parts of the system. It'd be like spraying a fire hydrant at a colander. I guess basically what I'm trying to say is we don't necessarily want to change tax rates, but modernise the tax system, not just tweak the rates. That's only half the problem. The real fix, reform over rates. Now look, let's be totally honest. I'm not saying we should all be thrilled to pay more tax. No one loves tax, and that includes me. But we do need to stop pretending that the only option is higher taxes or lower taxes. That sort of debate just feels very binary and misses the point. The real debate, in my view, should be about the design of the tax system and how we raise money. Because the interesting thing is, when you read a lot of papers and opinion pieces from left-wing think tanks or right-wing think tanks, A lot of them will say the same thing. They mostly agree on how the taxes should work, but they disagree on the rates. Both left-wing think tanks and right-wing think tanks all have the same criticisms of stamp duty and council tax. They just disagree on where it should sit. And to me, this just seems a much more reasonable and informed debate that we need to be having. We could be making the system fairer and simpler without necessarily raising rates. Even if we just rattled off a couple, merge income and national insurance rates to create a single transparent rate, update council tax bands to reflect the actual property value, close some of these absurd loopholes that let certain types of income escape tax entirely, align capital gains tax more closely with income tax. This way work and wealth are treated equally. Or if you wanted to go really balls to the wall, scrap every single VAT exemption but use that money to lower the overall rate of 15% or 12.5%. Or add new council tax bands. All those would make the system much more efficient, more honest, and much more sustainable, and much easier for the average person to be able to follow. And so here is the brutal truth about UK taxes. Yes, taxes have gone up. That is not an opinion, that is just a fact. But at the same time, a lot of the taxes that we do have are too messy, too outdated, too backwards to fund the country we say we want to live in. We want our schools to be like Singapore, our public transport to work like Austria or Germany, but we want to pay American rates of tax, and that's just not how it works. And we are doing this whole process backwards. We should start asking ourselves, with what do we want to have? NHS, national pension, free school meals, armed forces, or none of those things. Work out what you want, then work out what it costs and work backwards from there, rather than this constant tinkering and fettling of existing taxes or adding new ones. If you like this video, we have 3 videos on screen. We have tips from an ISA millionaire, we have how big tech is faking revenue, and we have this video just here on UK taxes. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks very much for watching.